On July 21st, 2023, a routine set of commands was sent up to a spacecraft sitting more than 12 billion miles from Earth, and something went wrong in a way nobody caught in time. A tiny error, just 2 degrees, tilted the spacecraft's antenna off its precise alignment with home. 2 degrees doesn't sound like much. At a distance of 12 billion miles, it was enough to sever contact completely. No commands could reach the spacecraft. No data could come back. For the first time in the entire history of the mission, NASA's engineers found themselves genuinely uncertain whether they would ever hear from Voyager 2 again. This is the true story of the longest silence in Voyager 2's 49-year mission, the desperate long-shot signal NASA used to try to reach it, and what this same aging spacecraft has continued quietly revealing to us in the years since, right up through some of the newest findings published just this year. Every detail in this video comes directly from NASA's own statements and reporting from the scientists and engineers who actually lived through it. Not exaggeration, not speculation, just the genuinely tense reality of what it takes to keep a 50-year-old spacecraft talking across interstellar distances. Let's start with exactly what happened, because the mechanics of this accident say a lot about how genuinely unforgiving distance becomes once you're operating this far from home. Voyager 2 depends entirely on a single antenna facility on Earth to receive any commands at all, a massive 70-meter dish in Canberra, Australia, called Deep Space Station 43. It's the only antenna on the entire planet capable of both reaching the extreme distance Voyager 2 has traveled and transmitting on the specific radio frequency the spacecraft's nearly 5-decade-old receivers are actually built to understand. The reason for that isn't simply a matter of upgrading other facilities either. Back in 1989, during Voyager 2's historic flyby of Neptune's largest moon, Triton, the spacecraft's trajectory was deliberately bent downward, out of the flat plane in which all the planets orbit, sending it on a path that carried it steadily southward relative to Earth ever since. That means Voyager 2 can now only be seen from the southern hemisphere, which is exactly why Canberra's dish is the sole facility on the entire planet with a direct line of sight to it, a quiet consequence of a single trajectory decision made nearly 4 decades ago that still shapes exactly how fragile this mission's communication really is today. On that day in July, a routine, planned sequence of commands was sent up to the spacecraft. And something in that sequence caused Voyager 2's own high-gain antenna, the one it uses to both send and receive every signal, to rotate 2 degrees away from where Earth actually was. That's all it took. 2 degrees, at a distance of over 12 billion miles, was more than enough to point the spacecraft's narrow radio beam completely past our planet, cutting off its ability to receive any further instructions and severely weakening the signal reaching Earth in return. For the next several days, NASA's Deep Space Network stations continued listening, and continued hearing nothing usable. By early August, engineers using the network's massive dishes had managed to detect a faint carrier signal, essentially a bare, wordless radio tone confirming the spacecraft was still alive and still transmitting something. But the signal was far too weak to carry any actual readable data. It was, in the most literal sense, a heartbeat with no words attached to it. Mission scientists later described this stretch as the longest blackout the Voyager program had experienced in decades, a genuinely unprecedented silence for a mission that had, up to that point, maintained remarkably consistent contact with Earth since 1977. Here's what made the situation so precarious, and why NASA's engineers couldn't simply try again the next day the way you might resend a dropped phone call. Every single command sent to Voyager 2 has to travel at the speed of light across more than 12 billion miles of empty space, a journey that, at the time of this incident, took roughly 18.5 hours in one direction alone. That meant any attempt to fix the problem wasn't a quick back and forth. It was a slow, agonizing process where a single command took the better part of a day just to arrive, and confirmation of whether it worked took another day on top of that. Voyager project manager Suzanne Dodd later explained to reporters that the team genuinely considered the odds of success low, given that the spacecraft's antenna wasn't oriented in any position to reliably receive a signal from Earth in the first place. There was, built into the spacecraft's own programming, a backup safety measure. Voyager 2 was designed to automatically reset and reorient its own antenna back toward Earth several times a year as a fault protection measure. Regardless of any outside commands, and the next scheduled autonomous realignment wasn't due to occur until October 15th. That gave engineers a hard deadline, but not a comforting one. Waiting for that automatic reset would have meant more than 2 additional months of total silence, with no way to confirm the spacecraft was even still healthy during that entire stretch, and no guarantee that the fault protection routine itself hadn't been affected by whatever had gone wrong in the first place. Either they found a way to reach the spacecraft sooner, or they would simply have to wait more than 2 additional months, hoping the spacecraft's own internal programming would eventually correct itself. Rather than wait, NASA decided to try something far more aggressive. On August 2nd, engineers at the Canberra facility used the most powerful transmitter available to them, firing a 100-kilowatt signal directly toward Voyager 2's last known position, deliberately timed to coincide with the best possible tracking conditions during that day's antenna pass. To put that power level in perspective, a typical household microwave operates at somewhere around 1 kilowatt. This was a single, continuous transmission running at 100 times that output, concentrated and aimed with extraordinary precision at a target smaller than a small car, sitting more than 12 billion miles away. NASA's own engineers, only half-jokingly, described this maneuver using a phrase that stuck with a lot of people who heard about it afterward. They called it an interstellar shout, a single brute-force burst of radio energy sent out into the dark, essentially betting that if they transmitted loudly enough, in exactly the right direction, at exactly the right moment, there was still a chance the spacecraft's antenna, even slightly misaligned, might catch enough of the signal to understand the instruction being sent, reorient itself, and point back toward home. Then came the wait. The signal itself took 18.5 hours just to reach Voyager 2's actual position, assuming it reached it at all. And because engineers had no way of instantly knowing whether the command had worked, they had to wait for any potential response to travel the same distance back, bringing the total waiting period to roughly 37 hours from the moment that shout left Earth to the moment anyone could possibly know its outcome. Try to imagine what that actually felt like inside the control room at JPL. There was no progress bar, no partial update, no way to check in halfway through and get a sense of how things were going. The team simply had to send their one best attempt and then wait for well over a day, with absolutely no information at all, knowing that whatever the outcome turned out to be had already been decided hours earlier, somewhere out past the edge of the solar system, long before anyone on Earth would find out about it. 37 hours of not knowing whether one of humanity's 2 functioning interstellar spacecraft, a machine that had already outlived its original mission by nearly 10 times over, was about to go permanently, unrecoverably silent. At around 12:30 in the morning Eastern Time on August 4th, the wait ended. Voyager 2 began transmitting again, clean, readable science and telemetry data, exactly as if the interruption had never happened. NASA confirmed that the spacecraft was operating normally and remained precisely on its expected trajectory. The interstellar shout had worked. A message sent across more distance than any human voice has ever reached had actually arrived, been correctly understood by a receiver built in the 1970s, and successfully guided that receiver back into alignment, all without a single person on Earth able to watch it happen in real time, or intervene if anything had gone even slightly differently. Mission scientists were careful afterward not to overstate the scientific loss involved in those 2 silent weeks. Because Voyager 2 studies conditions in interstellar space across extremely long timescales, missing roughly 14 days of continuous data wasn't considered a serious blow to the underlying science, but everyone involved was honest about what the incident actually revealed, which had nothing to do with the data itself and everything to do with just how fragile this entire 50-year mission has quietly become. A single, small, unintended error in a routine command sequence had come within 2 months of potentially ending contact with a spacecraft that had already survived flybys of 4 planets, a near catastrophic memory chip failure years later, and nearly 5 decades of continuous operation in one of the harshest environments any human-made object has ever endured. This wasn't even the first time Voyager 2 had gone quiet for an extended stretch. Back in March of 2020, NASA deliberately took Deep Space Station 43 offline for 11 months to perform critical, overdue upgrades, since some of the antenna's transmitting components were already 40 years old and increasingly unreliable, a genuine risk for a facility responsible for the only line of communication to an irreplaceable spacecraft. During that planned shutdown, Voyager 2 couldn't receive any commands from Earth at all for roughly 8 months, though smaller antennas at the same facility could still just barely pick up its outgoing science data, meaning the spacecraft could still speak, in a sense, even though nobody could speak back to it. Engineers deliberately placed the spacecraft into what they called a quiescent state before the shutdown began, trusting its onboard fault protection systems to keep it safe and stable without any outside guidance for the better part of a year. Jeff Berner, the Deep Space Network's chief engineer at the time, compared the situation to bringing an old car into the shop, explaining that there's never really a good time to take it offline, but that the work would make the whole system far more dependable going forward. When contact finally resumed on October 29, 2020, after a message traveling nearly 35 hours round trip, Voyager 2 responded exactly as hoped, confirming it had received and correctly executed the test commands sent to it. Suzanne Dodd told reporters at the time that the mission team had never actually stopped monitoring the spacecraft's health throughout that entire silence, tracking its faint carrier signal daily, and that if anything had gone wrong, they would have known. Taken together, these 2 very real, well-documented silences tell you something important about what it actually means to operate a machine this old, this far away, for this long, Every single decision involving Voyager 2 now happens inside a system with almost no room for quick correction, where a 2-degree pointing error or a routine antenna upgrade can suddenly become a genuine nail-biting question of whether humanity will ever hear from one of its own creations again. And here's the part of this story I think deserves real attention, because it's easy to focus purely on the crisis and the dramatic rescue and lose sight of what actually made both of those recoveries worth the risk in the first place. Voyager 2 kept talking. And because it kept talking, it kept teaching us things nobody else could. Just this past February, scientists finally solved a genuine 39-year-old mystery buried inside data Voyager 2 collected during its brief, historic flyby of Uranus back in 1986, using decades of newer research from events observed here at Earth to figure out that the spacecraft had very likely caught the planet in the middle of a rare, violent burst of space weather, dramatically supercharging its radiation belts in a way nobody could explain until this year. Researchers at the Southwest Research Institute compared Voyager 2's original measurements against a similar event recorded at Earth in 2019, and the match was compelling enough to finally explain data that had simply sat there unresolved for nearly 4 decades. That discovery didn't come from some brand new signal. It came from a machine that has been quietly carrying that answer inside its own memory for nearly 4 decades, waiting patiently for the rest of science to catch up. The exact same machine that came within a hair's breadth of falling permanently silent in 2023. And again in 2020, and that continues today, running on dwindling power, still transmitting real usable data from a region of space nothing else humanity has ever built has directly sampled. So here's what I actually want you to walk away with. Voyager 2's silence in 2023 wasn't some singular mystical event that unlocked a hidden secret the moment it came back online. What actually happened was smaller, and in its own way more remarkable. A 50-year-old spacecraft managed by a small, dedicated team of engineers working with unforgiving physics and a communication delay measured in days nearly slipped away entirely because of a 2-degree pointing error, and was brought back through nothing more than raw transmitter power, careful timing, and a very long, very anxious wait. It has done this twice now, once through a planned upgrade, once through a genuine accident, and both times it came back exactly the same machine it was before. Still working, still listening, still adding to a body of scientific knowledge that keeps quietly rewriting itself years after the actual data was originally collected. There's a broader lesson buried in this story too, one that applies to every future deep space mission humanity ever launches. As spacecraft venture farther and farther from Earth, the tools we have to protect them shrink down to almost nothing beyond careful planning and raw patience. There's no repair crew that can be dispatched, there's no quick reboot. There is only distance, physics, and a team of engineers willing to wait 37 hours to find out if a single desperate radio shout actually landed. That's the real, unglamorous truth behind humanity's presence in interstellar space, and it's exactly why every single moment Voyager 2 continues transmitting deserves to be treated as something worth paying close attention to. If you want to know what Voyager 2 finds next, whether from a fresh transmission or from decades-old data still waiting to be properly understood, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because after everything this spacecraft has already survived, I don't think we've heard the last surprising thing it has to tell us. And drop a comment telling me whether you think NASA should risk another interstellar shout if this ever happens again. Because based on the last 50 years, betting against this particular machine has never once paid off.